Hello again, and thank you for joining us on the Get to Know Canadian Gaming podcast presented by the Canadian Gaming Association. I'm your host, Steve McAllister, the Editor-in-Chief of Gaming News Canada. On this episode, we're pleased to welcome Andrew Brewer, the Senior Vice President of Policy and Communications for the Canadian Gaming Association. Amanda is also joined by special guest Andrew Gellatly, the Executive Director of the Alderney Gambling Control Commission since December 2022, and before that, a longtime journalist who was a sports and gambling beat writer at the Financial Times and also co-founder of the iGaming business media platform. Amanda and Andrew, first of all, a very happy new year to both of you. Amanda, I want to start with you because both Paul Burns and yourself indicated late last year a keen interest in getting Andrew to be your guest on the Get to Know Canadian Gaming podcast. And I know there's a story behind that.
Well, we've been lucky enough to spend time with Andrew. I don't want to make it sound like we're globetrotting, but in several locations around the world, as we've both been in town at the same time for conferences. And we managed to sit down with Andrew when he was in Toronto in the summer and had a conversation. And we were really interested about Alderney's approach to AML. As you know, AML is kind of a long-term project for the Canadian Gaming Association. And for me personally, we know in 2026, it will be an ongoing area of focus and interest as we continue to press for changes to our regulations, because in our opinion, they no longer keep pace with where our industry is at, which is online. It includes sports betting. It includes, iGaming. It includes horse racing. So, in our view, those regulations are woefully out of date and really not in touch with what the industry needs right now. So Andrew was kind enough to sit down and talk to us a little bit about Alderney's approach and its involvement in MONEYVAL. So I thought, how interesting to bring him on this podcast, allow him to talk about that beautiful risk-based approach that they use, which we're pushing for here in Canada, and especially because we've just gone through our own FATF, the Financial Action Task Force review. We know FINTRAC just did an exam of IGO, and we're waiting to find out what the results of that exam are. So we think this is a really good time to learn about best practices in other jurisdictions, and I think Andrew's going to be a perfect guest for that.
Hey, Andrew, before we get into it, You've been in the role, I think, just a little over 3 years now, and it's always interesting when I see a fellow journalist who takes a bit of a leap of faith and leaves the journalism world to try something new. I just wonder what prompted you to leave journalism and take on your current position with the commission.
Well, it is a slightly a poacher turned gamekeeper kind of a switch. What prompted me was actually the sale of Gambling Compliance, which is the organization, the regulatory information service that I started in 2006. We sold that, and I was enjoying a period of gardening leave when I was approached by the Alderney regulators, who I'd known and I'd written about since. Actually, I think I was the first person to write about them in the Financial Times in 2000 when the Alderney Gambling Control Commission was first started. And I think it was an interesting decision on their part, an inspired decision, you might say, to hire a journalist. But I've been enjoying the last 3 years of regulating online gambling in Alderney, in the island of Alderney. But through that time, as Amanda's previewed, we've been through a MONEYVAL evaluation. MONEYVAL is the regional body of the FATF in Europe, and we were the last country out of the 34 Council of Europe countries to be evaluated last year, and we did rather well. We finished 4th out of the 34. So we think we're in a good position as a credentialed AML CFT regulator in the gambling space. So if I can share any information from that experience, I'm happy to do so now.
Yeah, well, let's start with just maybe giving us our audience an overview of the commission, and including the scope of the regulatory authority, the number of operators the commission oversees, and also the history of the organization.
Yeah, of course. Okay, Alderney is part of the bailiwick of Guernsey, which is a group of 4 small islands in the Atlantic off the north coast of France, and it only has a population of about 70,000 people, all told. It's a crown dependency of the United Kingdom, like Gibraltar is and like the Isle of Man is. There are no land-based casinos here. There are a couple of betting shops, but we do at the AGCC have a lot of experience of overseeing online gambling of all types. The AGCC was around since the year 2000 and it has a long history dating back to the boom years of online poker, and before that, telephone betting even. So the AGCC, the Alderney Gambling Control Commission, supervises the online gambling sector. It doesn't supervise the domestic market in Guernsey. Instead, it oversees the international operations of its licensed operators, and that can be all over the world, from New Zealand to Canada. We have 21 B2C companies licensed in total, and not all licensees have a substantial physical presence in Guernsey, but all have an agent here at least and an office. And some actually have dozens of staff here, and they're usually based in Guernsey, not Alderney, but Guernsey is the biggest and most accessible island here. Last year, we did a count up of 4 of the largest entities we license in the e-gambling sector, and that's about 80% of the materiality here. And those 4 companies employed about 150 people working on e-gambling and contributed about £50 million to the bailiwick economy here. So that's 1.5% of GDP, small but significant still. We also regulate 11 platform providers for the online gambling sector. It's not a large population of supervised entities by any means. You could call it bespoke or boutique, but it means we get to spend a lot of time with our licensees, and we supervise them in a collaborative way and a professional way. And they're some of the largest online gambling operators in the world. In the 25 years since Alderney got established, almost all European countries and parts of the US and parts of Canada have legalized online sports betting. And in most cases, they've opted for their own domestic licensing regime. And we require the operators we regulate to respect that national and provincial and state level regulation. And we require disclosure from our operators of those markets and where they're operating and the locations of their active customers. Our supervision, in fact, focuses on the internal control systems that they use, and it's a very helpful reassurance to many other regulators around the world, particularly the ones that are just getting going. With our small, diverse range of operators, many of them are specialists in VIP high-end sports betting, and we can be, I think, a useful listening post in that market. We know that sports betting can be misused by criminal gangs in the manipulation of sports competitions, so we have memoranda of understanding and cooperative relationships in place with the anti-corruption teams at sports federations like FIFA and the IOC. We speak a lot with other regulators. We participate in Interpol's international match-fixing task force meetings, which are a unique opportunity to meet the law enforcement side of things. And with other regulators, we're part of the Gaming Regulators Europe Forum called GRAF, and the International Association of Gaming Regulators, which brought me to Toronto last year, the IAGRA. And the AGCC, we routinely respond to requests from other regulators and law enforcement authorities, and we ourselves request information from other regulators. It's essentially what we do is regulating by way of business. It's very different from the politically driven regulation you find in other parts of the world, particularly Europe, or regulation for revenue purposes, where the finance ministry is essentially running the regulation of gambling. We are just professional gamblers, the professional regulators. I'm sorry. Interesting slip there.
Amanda, I've listened to Andrew speak, and it brings me back to many of the conversations you and I have had on the Gaming News Canada show and on various other platforms over the past 4+ years. How familiar were you and Paul Burns with the Alderney Commission and kind of following what Andrew and his team does?
Well, without giving away how old I am or how long I've been working in this industry, some of those tiny little jurisdictions that Andrew was talking about, how I love that word bailiwick. We should have bailiwicks here in Canada. The Isle of Man, Gibraltar, Jersey, not New Jersey, but Jersey. So Alderney has always kind of been part of that. And I've never had the opportunity to go and visit any of those locations, but it's been thanks to Andrew and his colleague, Susan O'Leary, that we've actually become much closer, and they have been very helpful in sharing information with Paul and myself, especially as we were gearing up with an anticipated review by our Department of Finance of the FINTRAC regulations, Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing Act. It's a big mouthful. So they were kind enough to share some of their documentation with us, because we were hoping to be able to go in and present, best practices, as I said earlier, from other jurisdictions. And so, I look at Alderney as sort of, punching above its weight a little with what they're doing, especially given the volume of operators they seem to be able to work with very cooperatively, and the success they're having in terms of their MONEYVAL evaluations and the rest of their relationships. So I think Alderney is certainly a jurisdiction that a lot of others could learn from.
You mentioned MONEYVAL. That's a great segue to my next question for you, Andrew, and that is, what is MONEYVAL, and what entities participate in the processes, and how does it operate?
Yeah, sure. Well, MONEYVAL is based in Strasbourg, in France, and it's one of the regional bodies of the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force that you've mentioned before. And it's responsible. It's a monitoring body from the Council of Europe, and it's responsible for assessing all the countries in the Council of Europe, their compliance with international standards on money laundering and the financing of terrorism. Its aim is to ensure that the members have effective systems in place to fight financial crime. Canada, by contrast, is a full member of the Financial Action Task Force and is monitored directly. But the same FATF standards that apply via MONEYVAL apply to Canada too. MONEYVAL, like the FATF, operates through mutual evaluations and follow-ups that assess compliance. The process involves submission of information and technical submissions, an on-site visit, which usually takes a couple of weeks and involves visits to all of the agencies who supervise AML CFT. It involves drafting a report and recommendations and adopting a report, which happens at the plenary sessions in Strasbourg. And then there's follow-up monitoring to ensure that the recommendations from the reports are implemented. The evaluations happen on a 7-year cycle. I mentioned 35 countries in MONEYVAL, and we were the last country to be evaluated in the 5th round that ended last year, and the 6th round is just beginning now. MONEYVAL has countries that are members of the Council of Europe, but also Israel, Ukraine, and Azerbaijan are in MONEYVAL too.
What are the key benefits of participating in MONEYVAL?
Well, the main benefits are credibility. You can't really avoid it. And the evaluation team, when they came to see us, they saw us as an e-gambling regulator with a very full and very contemporary legislative framework, which meets the technical standards they have in the FATF recommendations. And it's fair to say, not all regulators of online gambling have been as fortunate as us in their assessments. Underperformance in the mutual evaluation can result in follow-up actions, which can be very costly and very time-consuming. If the mutual evaluation identifies strategic deficiencies in AML, the jurisdiction can be placed under increased monitoring, and that's known as affectionately as the naughty step. And if you don't get off the naughty step quite quickly within an agreed timeline, you then end up on the FATF grey list, which is a place that no offshore financial centre wants to be.
Yes.
In fact, it can be an existential problem for a small island like Guernsey and Alderney.
And how effective would you say is MONEYVAL's risk-based approach to AML practices?
Yeah, effective is the key word. It's a very good way to frame any conversation about MONEYVAL. The whole evaluation is all about proving effectiveness, particularly in the way risk reviews are conducted and sanctions implementation is conducted, and the way sanctions are used to ensure compliance. In the latest round of MONEYVAL evaluations, there was a focus on the financing of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, that's so-called PF financing. Now, that sounds unlikely in the context of gambling, but actually there are instances of funds from North Korean bank hacks being laundered in land-based casinos in Manila, and there's certain evidence that some hacked crypto assets have been played in online casinos too. Having processes in place that can demonstrate that daily sanctions checking is taking place against an updated list of North Korean, Russian, and Iranian sanctioned individuals, if you're talking to MONEYVAL, that's a good place to be. And essentially, the risk-based approach from MONEYVAL means understanding that risk is not static, and the Alderney Commission, continuously updates its understanding of changes in the money laundering and terrorist financing risks across our sector. We use all kinds of different means to get there. We do a sectoral risk review that incorporates relevant publications from international bodies. We have our own increasing experience of regulating e-casinos. We have a lot of mutual legal requests that go out from our financial intelligence unit. We've got suspicious transaction reports from our own e-casinos. We learn from other regulators. We learn from the mutual evaluation reports of comparable jurisdictions like ours, and our own national risk assessment and the national risk assessments of other countries. And taking this approach, I think, is very helpful in the context of gambling. It's led us to institute a number of requirements that really address risk. In Alderney, for instance, Customer identities must be verified before any gambling activity takes place. The AGCC has got to approve any third-party software used for verification, for automated verification. All methods of payment are scrutinized by the AGCC, and they're added to the internal control system standards that we monitor. The use of prepaid cards, which is quite a big thing now, is restricted to situations where customers have been fully verified, and only those payment methods subject to AML CFT regulation can be used. We ensure that gamblers' winnings are returned to their original payment method. That's a so-called closed loop system, and that's mandatory for Alderney licensed operators. Right now, we have no virtual assets of any kind permitted as a means of deposit or withdrawal, so no crypto. And we enforce that restriction, although crypto caches are available. But we are very aware of the use case for virtual assets in the online space, and we're monitoring progress on international regulation, and indeed we're participating in some FATF working groups on that subject.
Amanda, from a Canadian Gaming Association perspective, like what kind of strikes a chord with regards to MONEYVAL and the conversations that you're having with your members and also regulators across the country?
I think it's if we kind of boil it down to sort of very simple terms, it's when the online gaming industry launched in Ontario, FINTRAC basically took the standards that apply, the regulations that apply to our land-based industry, and just layered them over online, which, okay, we're both, we both have slots and, we both have sports, but how customers interact with them and how the money flows is very, very different. And some of our requests have been really about recognizing that this industry is very distinct and very different, and it's all electronically based. And that trying to have kind of one size fits all for money laundering reporting isn't very helpful, especially because there are glaring absences. We still don't recognize sports betting or horse racing in our regulations. And we are very report heavy. And we seem to be quantitatively obsessed with the number of reports that get filed versus looking for the qualitative outcomes in them. So if we could be more outcomes based, so instead of just mandating automatic report filing for suspicious transactions, what if we were paying more attention to what that outcome of that transaction was? And so there are, in our opinion, lots of different ways that we could still be very compliant, still be very vigilant in monitoring our customers and their money flows for suspicious activities, but reducing the burden of the filing requests and focusing on what the actual outcome is that we're trying to achieve. So looking at what Andrew's describing and just knowing that risk-based also implies that, especially because that's the AGCO standards here in Ontario, we'll tell you what the outcome is we want you to achieve. How you achieve it is up to you, as long as you're using compliant methods to achieve it, but we're not going to prescribe how you need to achieve it. So it's applying that theory, that operating approach to AML would be what the industry is ultimately after.
This next question is for the two of you. Andrew, I'll start with you. What emerging threats or opportunities related to AML do you foresee impacting our industry? And again, it feels like these are, I don't know if turbulence is the right word, but I guess certainly interesting times in the gambling industry, especially what we're seeing in the U.S. with regards to prediction markets. And as you mentioned earlier, kind of the virtual assets and the use of crypto now in the gambling business as well.
Yeah, I think there's risks and opportunities on both the regulator's side and on the entity's side. From a regulatory point of view, we still see ownership and control being the biggest issue in online gambling. We need to make sure there's no infiltration or criminal influence being exerted by criminals or their associates. And we've seen instances of front companies where licensing facilitates access to financial systems without the supervision going with it. One very important risk is supervised entities being used as conduits for non-gambling related activities that may be criminal, and revenue streams where they may gain access to the legitimate supply chain due to inconsistent regulation across different countries. We're seeing as a risk to operators, artificial intelligence, you mentioned, as definitely it's definitely being used to trick verification and registration processes. For example, to spoof the live video requirements you need when you sign up for a betting account. That's easily spoofed now with AI. Sometimes we see that this AI being used as a waypoint towards other financial fraud, whereby if a criminal can open a betting account, they can then take that form of identification and use it to open a bank account. It's it's one step a waypoint on a larger fraud process. We see risks in, I think I mentioned, multiple deposit mechanisms and the need for a closed loop system. You have to pay the money back to where it originated from. And we also see risks and opportunities in virtual assets and the use of distributed ledger technology, which, because they can be used to structure, because they can effectively be used to evade regulation, they're dangerous, but they can be, if supervised, they can present massive opportunities for the industry, and particularly to the younger generation of players who want to play online.
Amanda?
So looking at it from my Ontario/Canada hat, I would say that because we're a gray market, which meant we were trying to take existing operators and convince them to come in and get licenses. We know that there are still many operators that are accessing Ontario without licenses. And so that is automatically a high risk, a high threat, because we have absolutely no way to know what controls, whether it's player protections, it's AML, it's KYC, whatever it is. There's absolutely no ability for us to have a lens on that and be able to intervene if there are problems. So the ongoing work of the AGCO to try to clean up, the rest of the unlicensed operators in this market is one. But as Andrew said, because I see the emails come in from people all across Canada who are betting with operators that, we know there are some dodgy jurisdictions out there that don't have high levels of controls for their operators. But we know there's also crypto casinos that are operating. Crypto is illegal in Ontario. And I know it's an area that the regulator will continue to monitor, but for the time being, it's illegal. And so, you're almost powerless to try to get your money out of a crypto casino if you've got any issues with it. So because this is such a technologically based industry and it is changing at a blink of an eye. And, if you'd asked me this time last year, would I have predicted the rise of the prediction markets that we're seeing explode in the US, I would have said no. We don't have that same those same offers appear, those same products appear, but that doesn't mean things won't start. People will stop trying to get them across the border or trying to launch them in Canada. And I think it's just vigilance and being aware of what's out there, but especially with the money laundering, because criminals are clever, and especially with technology, there are places they can go and hide and things can just happen so quickly. I think the people who are, in charge of this and monitoring for this and trying really hard to make sure that things are compliant and money's not being, laundered to North Korea for arms, or 101 other horrible things that can happen. I think they're doing really important and very hard work. But I think, especially, again, just going full loop back to the way our regulations are currently undertaken, it's with one hand behind their backs right now, because they're kind of focusing on the wrong thing. They're focusing on, reports after reports after reports, which, we can argue until the cows come home if that's really the most effective way to detect money laundering. The last thing I'll say too is we know there are some calls, and not just in Canada, but internationally, to ban advertising they talk about sports betting, but it's gambling advertising. And I would push back on that and say, how will customers know who's a legitimate operator and a licensed operator or not? So without any advertising, then that lets the black market come back in, that lets illegal operators come back in, and that heightens the risk of customers then falling into gambling with operators that are laundering money, that are not engaging with, best practices or even, legal practices. So I would also say that, as we're heading back into, more rounds of discussions about sports betting advertising and whether they should be allowed or not, it's keeping in mind that because we have so many unlicensed operators still accessing Ontario and the rest of Canada and the rest of the world, quite frankly, advertising is really a way of letting customers know that the operators who are in that market are fully compliant with the regulations. So that's my little roundup of all the current issues that Paul and I will be working on in 2026.
I very much agree with Amanda there. I don't think there's ever been a time in the history of online gambling where the grey market and the regulated market have existed so closely side by side. You go to a major trade show like ICE or IGB or one of the European shows, and there are the same crypto payment providers that are not licensed anywhere and have no oversight whatsoever, alongside completely regulated ones. And it's very hard to tell the difference, and it's never been quite as permeable as that, I would say.
Andrew, did you want to just your thoughts on the advertising piece that Amanda mentioned?
Well, yes, I completely agree on the differentiation. It's really almost impossible for a regulated operator to survive in a European market now. If they have a national license, they're paying tax at a high rate. They may probably be facing advertising restrictions. Their ability to get a share of voice in the market is extremely hampered, and the overall trend in nationally regulated markets in Europe is to see the licensee numbers falling away. It's simply not sustainable. You cannot maintain a compliant and regulated operation in a market where there are advertising restrictions and increasing tax burdens. The two things together make markets unviable.
A couple more questions, Andrew. I want to ask you about your involvement in the FATF iGaming working group, and just about the people, the participants involved in that working group, and the objectives of the group.
Yeah. This is something that came out of after our MONEYVAL evaluation last year, and was coincidental, but it happened to be starting early last year. It's called the RTMG. It's the Risks, Trends, and Methods Group on gambling, and it involves research into the changing patterns of risk in gambling, both land-based and online, and it aims to clarify the coverage that FATF standards give to various sort of gaming and gambling business models. Right now, there are 40 individual experts participating in the group, but the survey that began the group's work last summer got 68 responses from 68 different countries. It covers both online and land-based, as I said, so our input is largely from the online side. We look at the risks derived from illegal, unlicensed operations, for example. We're looking at the challenges faced by online gambling regulators. In terms of the project timeline, the implementation plan was June last year, and the first draft of the report is now out and being evaluated and undergoing comments. There are 3 more rounds of drafting, and it's expected the final document will be available June 2026 this year.
And that'll be a public document, Andrew? Anyone can...
Well, it's still under discussion. Again, that's something that will probably need to be resolved at the plenary. But I've given you, when I talked about emerging threats and opportunities, I think I gave you some hints of what might be included in it.
Yeah, so this was a discussion when Paul and Andrew and I met. Andrew was sharing this with us as well. And I had asked at that point in time if it would be possible for Ontario to participate, because it's currently the only jurisdiction with regulated gaming, knowing that the evaluators from FATF were due to land in Canada in November, and thinking it would be a good opportunity for us to get plugged into what's going on. Again, under the headline of global best practices, it would be a great opportunity to get AGCO IGO plugged into that. So Andrew, what is how would a jurisdiction put their hand up and express interest in participating?
It's up to the countries, not so much the regulators, to put themselves forward, and the countries can put forward experts. It's open to all countries, though, who are members of the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF. You put forward an expert for inclusion, they get vetted and they get included. We were included on the drafting side of the report because we know about the challenges faced by supervisors of online gambling. I mean, it's very important for us as a small nation, because typically we go wherever the FATF wants us to go, and we don't have a hand on the steering wheel. Now we sort of feel we do have a bit of a hand on the steering wheel. I would say the US and Canada are not participating in the working group at this point.
I'll have to write a polite letter to our Minister of Finance.
I'm just going to ask him, man, in terms of, a country, like what ministry or where would that fall under, kind of given Canada's in a unique position with the provinces kind of conducting and managing gaming?
Yeah, I would say it might be, if we ask our Minister of Finance here provincially to contact his federal counterpart and express interest in, finding out if Ontario can participate on behalf of Canada. We are expecting, hopefully, in the next couple of weeks to get an announcement. Service Alberta just sent out an invitation yesterday for another consultation on the 13th, and Minister Nally will be talking. So that should signal, I don't know if we'll get a market launch date, but something should be coming, probably a tax rate and who knows what else. But, we should have another province coming online in 2026. So, with two provinces, I would think that might bolster Canada's inclusion. So I'll put that on my to-do list for 2026.
Andrew, when you decided to take on the job as executive director of the commission back in 2022, you mentioned Canada and the changing gambling landscape here in this country, and I'd just love, before we wrap up, to get your thoughts on what you've seen happen here over that 3-year period.
Well, it was obviously Ontario was in discussions to come online even before I joined the AGCC, right. And I'm very, very happy to have been part of a regulator that has worked very well with the regulators on Ontario. And some of our biggest operators are operating with licenses in Ontario from the province there, and have been very successful. I've watched the market, with great interest. It's and I'm looking forward to other provincial regulators following that lead. But there's been a lot to learn. You guys are much closer to the coalface than I am, but nevertheless, it's a unique and very sports focused market, obviously, which we're very, very happy to support, and we're very happy. Our licensees are doing well in Canada, and they report good things.
Because we're recording this podcast in the first week of a new year, I want to finish by asking the two of you kind of what's top of mind. Andrew, I'll start with you, and I'll give the last word to Amanda. But in terms of the Alderney Gambling Control Commission, kind of what's on your plate for the next 12 months, or what's at the top of your priority list?
Yeah, I think to go back to the virtual assets topic, we've been working on another FATF working group on the use of virtual assets and virtual asset service providers for criminal money laundering. And we've been working with I think around 18 European jurisdictions have contributed to this. We're looking at typologies of criminal usage of VASPs. We know from the FATF's papers that were published June last year that it's no longer possible in a jurisdiction to maintain the idea that prohibition is working. There is always going to be some virtual asset usage in your country, whether you prohibit it or not. So what you need to do is find a way of implementing FATF's recommendation 15 and the travel rule, which identifies the sort of provenance of virtual asset transfers. And we're working right now with a number of blockchain tracking services to look at the feasibility of getting oversight over the flows of virtual asset funds, and getting some insight into how reliably we can identify and point to source of wealth, source of funds with certainty. So I think that's our big project this year. We've additionally, it's a big betting year for our European operators with the World Cup, and I'm guessing in Canada too. So I think our sports betting operators are looking forward to a good year, and so are we.
And Amanda, I know the Canadian Gaming Association has a very ambitious agenda for 2026.
Well, good timing, because Paul and Brandon and myself just spent an hour and a half reviewing our 2026 strategic plan yesterday. So I guess big news, and I'm sure Paul will come back and talk about this some other time, is this week CGA with Ad Standards Canada launched their responsible gambling code. So our members are now voluntary participants for that code, and it is not replacing anything that the AGCO has in the AGCO regulations. It's just a kind of an enhancement to it, because we get maligned so often that we don't do anything or have anything. So the code has now launched, and there'll be more coming on that soon. The sports betting bill S211, which has turned into a sort of desire by many senators to outright ban all advertising, is going to be a renewed focus for us. AML and our ongoing efforts to try and reform the regulations for operators will still be an ongoing effort. Alberta opening, and trying to make sure that the Alberta regulations are the best they can be and don't deviate too much from Ontario's. Trying to promote our members and their activities and their interests, as much as we can in Ontario. But, I say to Paul all the time, we have the best laid plans in January, and sometime around May, everything's gone sideways because things we can't even predict have dropped out of the sky and landed right in front of us. So I'm always excited to see what this year will bring. We'll certainly be working a lot in Ottawa on things that are happening in Ottawa, but with the addition of Brandon in Alberta, great timing, because as I said, I expect we'll get news that market will open in this year, and the CGA will start expanding, the efforts that it will be undertaking in that province as well, just like it did in Ontario. So I'm really excited for this year. And I want to say, I predict that the Blue Jays will win the World Series. I'm taking my love away from the Toronto Maple Leafs this year.
Hey, Andrew, just on that, do you have a favorite for the World Cup?
You can never ignore Spain, I think. That would be my choice.
Yeah, Toronto will go nuts because we are a city of little neighborhoods, and so every different country will have its neighborhood pub or bar, and the AGCO extends liquor licenses. We'll be a host city for some of the games, so the city does go very enthusiastically wild for any World Cup here. But yeah, Blue Jays for the World Series this year, Steve.
Okay, we know there's a large segment of soccer fans in Toronto hoping Italy can qualify and play Canada the World Cup, which would be something else. Yeah, Amanda Brewer is the Senior Vice President of Policy and Communications for the Canadian Gaming Association. Andrew Gellatly is the Executive Director of the Alderney Gambling Control Commission. Andrew, it feels like we should do a Get to Know Guernsey podcast at some point. Maybe something to think about. We could discuss later in 2026.
Yeah, we have a very active tourist board here, encouraging influencers and bloggers to come to Guernsey and talk about it. So yeah, we should be one of those.
We'll work on that. That's it for the first episode of the Get to Know Canadian Gaming podcast of 2026. Andrew and Amanda, thanks so much for being with us. For more information on the Canadian Gaming Association, please go to its website at canadiangaming.ca. And thanks everybody for listening to this podcast.
Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks.